Chapter 19. Letters Never Sent. The morning after the festival, the lake town felt like a room that had been swept and then left to rest. The shore neat and quiet, the rows of drying lanterns waiting to be folded and stored, the water patient and clean. Aiden and Mira stood at the window of their small room for a long time without speaking, looking at the place where the last lantern had glowed against a notch in the trees, as if the night had chosen a bookmark and still held the page open. They packed without hurry because the ease that the festival had given them asked for gentle movements. And then they walked to the innkeeper to thank her and accept a parcel of bread and 2 small jars of tea. On the way to the station, they crossed the porch where the paper notice had first invited them to the evening by the water. And the notice now had a light bend at each corner and a tiny water stain in the shape of an almond. Mira traced the stain and smiled, saying water always signs what it loves, and Aiden nodded as if he could see the ink answer. The conductor greeted them like old friends and asked if the lake had kept its promises, and he seemed satisfied by their simple yes. The train rolled along the slow bends of the valley and then into the lowlands, and after a day of patient travel they stepped again onto the platform at Waverly Bay and felt a familiar air take hold of them, like the gentle pull of a scarf being arranged just right. The cat made a circle as if drawing an embrace on the boards. The attendant asked if the lantern from the lake had learned the voice of the sea yet, and Aiden said it would soon because they would give it time to listen. They walked home by the quiet streets and saw their cottage holding its shape in the late afternoon light. The 2 windows like eyes that had stayed awake in kindness while the room rested. Inside, the lantern from the festival stood dry and clean on the table, and beside it a folded note from the librarian waited under a pressed sprig of rosemary. The note said only that the square had been quieter in their absence, in the way rooms are quieter when a songbird has gone to another window to sing for a while, and that the board had missed their small cards, and that everyone would like to hear about the lake when they felt ready to tell it. They warmed water and drank the tea the innkeeper had wrapped, and they placed the lantern from the lake next to the first lantern they had made and watched how the room changed with 2 quiet shapes on the table. The aqua glass looked deeper for the company. The windows looked wider for the memory of the water. As evening thinned into its first true darkness, they lit their home lantern and let the festival lantern remain quiet, and the 2 lights in their separate ways seemed to understand each other, one with flame and one with memory, both adding to the stillness that gathers after a journey when a house is learning the new things brought home in pockets and paper and breath. In that calm hour, while the kettle clicked and the day put its work away, Aiden reached into the pocket of the satchel that had followed him from the city to the coast and from the coast to the mountains and back again, and he drew out a thin bundle tied with simple string. The paper was the color of old cream and carried the faint scent of cedar and a trace of something floral that had to be imagined rather than named. He held the bundle for a moment as if to weigh it, and then he placed it on the table beside the lanterns and looked at Mira with the shy steadiness he wore when a thought had been living in him for a long time and had finally decided it would like to be seen. He said he had meant to show her these pages on some evening that felt safe, and that this evening felt like the right shore for that small boat. He had written them during the first weeks after he arrived in town, when the café had become a gentle island and the ferns had offered him green in the way a room offers a chair, and the clock tower had counted his days with patience. He had written them without a plan to send them, but with an urge to keep them, because sometimes a thought wants a home and will not be turned away. Mira listened with her eyes more than her ears, the way she did when plants told her what they needed through the lift and fall of leaf. She knew the bundle at once, not by sight but by the shape of care around it. She placed her hand on the table, not on the papers but near them, and she said that if the letters wished to walk into the room, they would be welcomed and treated kindly. Aiden untied the string. He did not lift all the pages at once. He took the first letter from the top and read it in his own voice, which softened as he found the sentences of the man he had been when he first came through the cafe door with a sketchbook that felt heavier than it was. The man who thought he had left behind a city that owned too many of his hours and had not yet learned that a small town could hold them without ownership and simply place them where they fit. The letter told the quiet story of that first afternoon. It described the way the lantern glass above the counter gathered light and returned it as a square on the table near the window. It described a young woman with ferns around her like attentive friends. It described a smile he had not earned but had been given freely, a smile that told him the café belonged to people who were not in a hurry to purchase their comfort. The letter said he had drawn the glass before he drew the face because the glass felt like a promise he could keep and the face felt like a promise he did not yet understand. It said he had written her name on the back of the sketch once he learned it from the owner, who had said Mira with a fondness that made the word feel like a green stem between the tongue and the teeth. When he finished reading, he did not look up at once. He let the letter return to the table and rest under his hand. Mira breathed a little deeper and smiled the small smile she gave to simple truths. And she said that this story sounded like the one the café had told her from the other side of the room without using words. He took up the second letter. It was shorter and more direct, and it told of the first rain that made him run without thinking to the awning where she already stood, and of the cup of chamomile she offered from her thermos, and of the way the steam rose in a small line that carried the scent of a summer night into a wet afternoon. It told of the sketchbook that had taken the rain and the laugh they shared when the paper curled like a sleepy cat. And it said he had walked home feeling lighter in a way that had nothing to do with the weight of the water he had shaken from his shoulders. He read that letter aloud and watched her eyes warm with the memory of the awning and the sound of rain as it softened on fabric before sliding away. She reached for her own satchel without getting up and drew out a single card folded into thirds. The card with the little green leaf she had pressed there from the greenhouse when he had first come up the hill to see how moonlight makes some flowers open their voices. She said she had written a note the night after the rain and had left it on the board with no address, only a drawing of a cup and a small square of blue colored in with pencil. and she had said thank you for letting the paper curl and not trying to make it something it was not. Aiden laughed, the quiet laugh that often lives at the edge of sleep, and told her he had kept that card and placed it inside the back cover of his book where he kept things that steadied him. The third letter waited like a pause. It had been written on a morning when the sea lay very still and the town made almost no sound, and he had taken his breakfast to the dock and watched a small boat move without hurry and thought of a person who moves without hurry in the presence of green things. In it he had written that he believed he was traveling toward a feeling he had met only in brief visits, and that the feeling had to do with steadiness and attention and the light on a particular cheek in a particular room at a particular hour, and that he feared naming it out loud would make it flee the way shorebirds leap away when a footstep lands too close. He read that letter slowly as if the words could bruise, and when he placed it down the room seemed to exhale. Mira did not speak. She poured a little more tea and then touched the side of his hand with the side of her hand, a contact small and enough. Aiden sorted the papers and found the one he had never intended to read to anyone. It was written a few weeks later when spring had begun to arrive in the shape of longer evenings and the memory of fireflies in the mind of every child, and the café had been warm with small lamps as the owner wiped the counter and set the chairs upside down. He had written after that night, alone in the cottage he had rented from a fisherman for a month while he found his footing. The letter had no greeting because he could not think of how to begin something that felt at once delicate and solid. It told the story of the moment when Mira had bent her head over a book and a lock of hair had found the bridge of her nose and she had brushed it back with a motion that looked like kindness to herself. Aiden read the description and felt it happen again in front of him, as if reading called a scene into present time. He had written that he knew then without a speech that he would love her, not with fanfare but with the habit of care, the way he had learned to keep brushes clean and notebooks dry and cups warmed before tea goes in. He had written that love might be a word used too loudly in too many rooms, but in that small square of light it had felt like a word that wanted to be handled with careful hands. He had written that he would not send the letter, because sometimes the best way to keep a truth is to let it stay unclaimed, but he would carry it folded and close, and he would treat the days as if the letter had been sent and received all the same. When he reached the end, he realized that his voice had dropped to almost a whisper, and he did not know at what sentence it had done so, only that it had been right to do it. The lantern breathed a little, and the bubble in the aqua pane gathered a pinch of gold and released it again. Mira kept her hand near his and looked at the folded papers and at his face and then at the window where horizon had begun to show a gentle line of water. She said she had known by a different road. She had known not from letters on paper but from small letters written by hand in the world. The way he never hurried the turn of a page when he read to her in the library, and the way he tied a knot as if a knot could feel whether it would be comfortable living its whole life in that place, and the way he stood in the greenhouse with the lantern low and let the room teach his eyes rather than making the room serve his plans. She said she had known by the way his voice held her in the clock tower when the light had gone out in the town and they had climbed to set the candles, and by the way he had stood beside her when the storm had taken the greenhouse roof and had not counted the hours it cost him, and by the way he had painted her under the moon and stopped at the exact right breath when the painting had learned to be itself. She had known all along, and she said that knowing had not been a secret so much as a quiet shared between them that they were both able to read without ink. He smiled in the way a person smiles when a weight they had carried without complaint is taken from their arms and set down on a table where it becomes a gift. He asked if she had letters of her own, and she reached into a small tin in the cupboard and placed on the table a stack of cards and slips and petals that had words written under them with pencil. She kept the cards simple because the plants did not like heavy sentences near their roots. On the back of a pressed rosemary leaf she had written the day after they had walked in the rain a note that said, "This leaf holds a memory of steam and the sound of drops on fabric and a strange happiness that feels like a soft coat." On a folded napkin from the café she had written the week of the market of small wonders, that his laugh made the room exhale and that the blue square of glass looked like a lake inside a song. On a library catalog card she had written the afternoon he had read to her that his voice had a way of not pulling on a line but walking next to it and letting it go where it needed to go. None of these had been sent because there had been no address to write and because the messages had been carried by days rather than by envelopes. She slid them across the table and he read them and laughed and kept from laughing and thanked each one in the low voice that suited their size. The kettle clicked again and they poured more hot water and the room filled with a steam that carried the faintest honey scent from the jar on the shelf. Aiden set his letters back into a bundle, but not all of them. He kept the last one out and folded the string around the others, then placed that final page into a clean envelope and wrote Mira on the front with the quiet ceremony of a person filling a doorway with a simple presence. He said he did not need to send it anywhere because here was the place it had always wanted to be delivered. She took the envelope and did not open it again. She said that the reading had been the opening and that the paper could rest now. The evening leaned toward night. Haven showed the square tidying itself for sleep. A chair turned in, a light pinched, a hand lifted in a window with the easy signal of neighbors who expect to see each other tomorrow. Horizon held a silver path that grew narrower and then widened again as a thin cloud passed in front of the moon and moved on. The lantern light made a warm seam at the edges of the room, and the two windows learned to share it the way they had shared every season since they had been named. Aiden reached for his sketchbook and made a small drawing of the bundle on the table. Soft lines to show paper and string and the edge of the envelope and the corner of a pressed leaf. He dated it and wrote letters never sent, and then beneath that a little arrow pointing toward the window where their lives had become a collection of sent messages without stamps. Small acts across a table, steady help when the day lifted a weight, laughter left in a room to be found later like a folded blanket. Mira wrote in her notebook that letters can live inside lanterns and windows and people. and that some letters are best read in the head of the person who wrote them and in the hands of the person who listens to them without asking for evidence. She drew a square and then another facing it, and inside she drew the pale shape of a flower and a single brush resting near it. And she gave the drawing no label because anyone who needed to know would know. They cleaned the cups and placed the papers in a shallow drawer they had kept for lost and found things. A drawer that held a tiny shell, 2 pebbles the color of tea, a scrap of ribbon the color of seagrass, a ticket stub with a good date, and a map drawn by the boy who used to wear red mittens. They closed the drawer slowly as if to keep any echo from escaping and getting cold. Before they slept, they walked up the hill to the greenhouse, because the room had a way of wanting to hear the latest chapter of their days before the night folded over the town. The hill knew them and gave their steps a small spring. The greenhouse welcomed them with the soft crack of settling wood and the patient scent of plants that hold light inside their leaves like a saved story. Aiden's bloom lifted 2 flowers even though the hour was late for opening. The lantern swung a little as they entered and learned their breath and found its balance. Aiden told the room they had read the letters and that the letters had thanked the room for teaching them to walk without rushing. Mira opened her notebook and read aloud the page where she had written the names of seedlings that had learned to lean toward the table. The greenhouse listened and answered with the particular hush that happens only when people speak to a place as if it can understand. It can in its way, and it did. On the way home the sea pressed a quiet against the stones, and the stars showed fewer and bigger as the night deepened. At the cottage they did not add another light. They let the lantern keep what it had, and they stood at the place between the 2 windows and let the small pull of sleep begin to guide them. Aiden said that reading the letter he had never sent felt like setting a lantern gently on a lake he had carried in his chest for a long time. Mira said that hearing it felt like watching that lantern find its reflection and settle into a path. They agreed without speaking that the letter would not go into a frame or a glass box, that it would live with the other small pieces in the drawer that made sense of their days. The clock tower offered a kind note from the square, and the sea offered a reply from the far side of the window, and the cottage gathered those 2 messages and made them into a quiet that pulled them toward the bedroom they had made in the soft color of winter. They lay under the quilt and let their breaths speak to each other like neighbors, and sleep found them at the same time, as if the night had read a letter with both their names on it and chosen to answer